it's been easy for the Fed to decide what to do, whether to raise the rates or not, because all they were really doing was fighting inflation. The other problems were not a problem. Well, now they got problems with all three. So if inflation is no longer the hardest thing to fight, you might see them cut rates. Certainly they have to pause first before they cut. December 13th is put up or shut up time.
Get ready for a new episode of KP Talks Dollars and Cents. Learn financial literacy and get real-time updates on all things housing, finance, and real estate. So let's get started. Here's your host, Kevin Perenio.
Hey, it's KP coming to you live from Newport Beach. We'll do a little walk and talk here down to the Back Bay. It is 10 p.m. on a Monday, and we are in the midst of a soft landing. This is the soft landing. But before I get into that and talk about why that's problematic for our industry, I want to give a big shout out to Salesforce. We are users of Salesforce, and they're a great vendor partner. Been with them, gosh, I think our company's been with them since January of 17, I think is when we got the contract together, and they put on a great event sponsoring the Orange County chapter for ALS, which is Lou Gehrig's disease. And it's a very brutal disease. As everyone knows, it's a neurodegenerative disease. It has a 3 to 5 year life expectancy. And I want to thank Kelly Sirocco and the rest of the team there putting on that event today. Raised $15,000 for a local chapter. And I know some of you out here have faced that battle in your family. I know it's tough. Jeff, I know your dad's 2 years into his diagnosis. Friend Sean, his grandmother, and then we had a commercial real estate broker named Bo in Austin, Texas at CB Richard Ellis that passed from it. He used to help us find our first Magnus offices around town. So tough disease, I know, very similar to Parkinson's, which my dad faced for 22 years. Slower burn with Parkinson's and very similar caretaking at the end. So thanks again to Salesforce. So, so CPI is coming out tomorrow. The Consumer Price Index is coming out in the morning, and PPI comes out the next day. And, the Fed's fighting inflation. And I was asked today by Kelly, what's going to happen next year? And it's interesting because, I could say the Fed is going to raise one more. They've been very, consistent in their message. The last dot plot said they're going to go up one more, and there's one more meeting on December 13th. And I don't see any reason to think they're not going to go up because they've been doing everything they said. And so this is why I'm saying this, because there's some data there for everyone, right? That's why it's a soft landing. It's like you could say, well, inflation's been coming down. We were like 8%, 2 years ago and, or a year ago. And now, a year ago. And then, our last CPI reading, Consumer Price Index reading, was showing 4.7%, I believe, was the core reading. So I may be wrong on that number. 3.7%. Estimate tomorrow's like 3.3% or 3.4%, which is coming down. And you could say it's coming down. So, hey, the Fed's doing their job. We don't have to raise anymore. But then someone could say, well, they said they're going to 2%. And that's not 2%. And if the core reading, I believe, was 4.1%. And if it holds at 4.1% again, then that would be a time where it's like 6 CPI prints in a row where the number's been coming down on core CPI, but then it stayed steady. So does that mean it's sticky? So someone could say, hey, we're not near 2, and so we got to raise some more and break something else to break demand and get inflation down. So something for everybody out there. And that's kind of what a soft landing is about. I mean, let's talk about some other data points. We've been talking about a recession for 2 years. Credit card debt's high. Savings are getting blown through. Labor is softening. The last jobs report was pretty weak, right? Soft labor. But labor's not broken. We're not a job loss recession. We don't have, we have high continuing claims at 1.8 million, but only 217,000 new claims per week. We have a 3.8% pretty healthy unemployment rate right now. So it's not great. So it could go either way, right? So labor hasn't broken. Commercial real estate hasn't broken. By the way, survive till 25 is from commercial real estate. Okay, so a lot of people have been hearing me say this all year, how I think it's dumb. Yes, it rhymes. And I was at the Mortgage Bankers Association National Convention. A lot of people were saying it in Philadelphia. That's nothing to do with our business. That has to do with $1.4 trillion of commercial real estate loans coming due in 2024 that all have to refinance at a higher rate. Those are the guys that have to survive. We've been getting crushed in housing. It has been a recession in housing. And because it was a soft landing, housing's been getting crushed. Let me explain. We have some people here who work, on the vendor side and then, down with all the cycles that we go through. Housing is great in a recession. Rates go down, and then there's a lot of refinance activity and more purchase demand because rates are lower. And so our recession started a year and a half to 2 years ago. Let's call it a year and a half ago. So we're going to be going through it for about 2 years by the time the Fed cuts the rates next year, sometime between March and July. And so that is a housing recession. So soft landing just prolongs this brutal time that we've been deleveraging all this capacity in our housing system. So when recession starts and the Fed cuts the rates, whenever that is, that's actually really good for our business. And our recession is over, even though other parts of the economy would be in a recession, like a job loss recession. So this is the soft landing. This is what it looks like, whether you like it or not. Here's the back bay back here. I'm going to make my way back since I'm about 5.5 minutes in. So the CPI print tomorrow is mostly housing data. The Fed prefers the PCE, the personal consumption expenditure, which is real-time expenditures. And it got a little less weighting on housing, whereas the CPI is very heavily housing weighted, anywhere from 38 to 41%, just depending on when, depending on the weighting. Owner's equivalent rent, housing, and it's 12-month lagging data too. So it'll be interesting to see if core stays the same at 4.1 while headline goes down, how the markets will react. Remember, our third mandate of the Fed, not just price stability and maximum employment, full employment, but also, moderate long-term interest rates like the 30-year Treasury, the long bond, and they've been going up. That's a problem, and that's a problem because over the next 36 months, listen to this, $17.5 trillion of our federal debt, or $33 trillion, okay, more than half, will have notes coming due at higher interest rates. We can't afford it. Bloomberg just put out a report last week. It said for the next 12 months, our interest on our debt is $1 trillion. $1 trillion just in interest payments. About $7 trillion of our $33 trillion debt is owned by foreign debt. Japan owning the most at $1.1 trillion. China, which has been shrinking the balance sheet since 2010 of their U.S. Treasury, is $868 billion. And we are paying a lot of interest payments. Now, the U.S. taxpayer owns the most debt, right? Whether it's through pension funds or Social Security. So we own the most of it. But it's unsustainable, and everyone knows it. That's why it wasn't just the last Fed meeting and the jobs report, but when Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen came in lower on new Treasury issuance for this quarter, she announced at the end of October. Remember, we had $1 trillion in new issuance last quarter. The estimate for this quarter was going to be like $830 billion, and it'll be like $780 billion. So it was lower, and that's part of why the yields on the 10-year have come down to like a little bit lower of a range, not bumping up against 5%, but kind of bumping around 4.75, down to 4.45. So we still have a lot of debt. And so with all this new issuance coming out and old debt rolling over, one thing that might crack are banks, because these institutions own a lot of our debt, and these interest payments are crushing. So when the Fed finally does cut, they're probably going to cut pretty heavy, anywhere from 50 to 100 basis points on the first cut, just to get the interest payment down. We have to float our balance sheet. We cannot be a debtor, broke-ass nation. So interesting to watch the CPI come out tomorrow and all that comes out with it. Hopefully, someone said to me today, just talk about housing real quick, it felt like Thanksgiving already started, got a little slow today. And this is seasonally the slow time. So, I don't think Survive to 25 is appropriate in our business, but winter is coming. The next few months are slow, and it might be slower because, labor is breaking. In some housing news, the federal, Oversight Committee, Financial Stability Oversight Committee, FSOC, which is created by Dodd-Frank, which reports to the Treasury Department, the executive branch. is naming independent mortgage bankers financial, SIFIs, significantly important financial institutions. So I'm going to start with servicers, but they're in a long line of independent mortgage companies and other companies out there that the FSOC is going to be looking at to make sure that we're financially stable. It's not too big of a deal, but our industry is being looked at, banks are being looked at, institutions are being looked at. Debt's a big deal. Let's pray for a low CPI number tomorrow and keep grinding away. Cheers.
Hey, it's KP coming to you live from Corona, California. Well, the soft landing is coming to an end. How hard will it get? That's the question. We've been talking about a recession for 2 years. I talked about this a little bit on my video Monday night. But again, we've been talking about a recession for 2 years, and it didn't come. It didn't come when everyone thought it was going to come. And the reason why is because we had a soft landing. There's a lot of money in the system. There's a ton of cash floating around from years of zero Fed fund policy. You've got CARES Act money. You've got people that locked in super low, historically low rates to have fixed housing payments, which, as we know, is one of the biggest components in CPI, inflation. And you had people with record savings. You got some stimmy checks that came out. And we've been talking about credit card debt building. We've been talking about savings going away. We've been talking about higher interest rates. We've been talking about how everything's more expensive. We've got core, we got super core, we got inflation, we got food, we got energy, we got all kinds of stuff. The soft landing is coming to an end. And for those that know, I don't watch a lot of TV, but I came out of retirement when season 7 of Game of Thrones came on, and I every winter I say winter is coming. Well, I got some more advice. We all know winter's coming. We know winter is tough in our business, and seasonally it's a tough month. You got January and February, not the greatest, but you start to thaw out. Let's go one more piece of advice. Instead of just saying winter is coming, what is the advice? Well, remember, the lone wolf dies and the pack survives. Now is the time to band together, and everything that you've built upon is going to get you through the winter and then come out the other side kicking ass in 2024. Don't believe me? Well, let's talk about it. If you go into a recession, interest rates typically come down. The Fed is forced to cut rates. Why is the Fed forced to cut rates? Because things are softening. I want to talk about a couple things and the cumulative effect of how everything builds on each other. I was watching the folks at MBS Highway on one of their podcasts this week, and they were recapping the Consumer Price Index report that came out. And they were talking about, after it came out on Tuesday morning, that yes, inflation is coming down. The rate of inflation is slowing, but it's still going up. And it's been going up for years. And so we are talking about inflation slowing. And so be careful. Barry brought up a really good point. Be sensitive to people out there when you're talking, hey, good news, inflation's coming down. Well, the rate of inflation going up is slowing. That's what I call less bad news, but it's still inflation. And of course, wage inflation has been going up, but that's slowing. So if wages have been going up over the years to help you keep up with rising prices, you may not feel as bad. But now job losses are happening on top of inflation that's been cumulative on top of each other every month over month. Yes, CPI was a fantastic print, and it's a precursor of what's to come. Remember, the Fed has had this mandate, right? They have a 3-part mandate, okay? Talk about the dual mandate, but it's really a 3-part mandate. They always talk about price stability, which means control inflation. Full employment, which means have unemployment as low as possible, and try and keep, the economy full of jobs. And then, of course, moderate long-term interest rates is the 3rd part. Well, those rates are going up. Employment's getting worse. And inflation is coming down. It's been easy for the Fed to decide what to do, whether to raise the rates or not, because all they were really doing was fighting inflation. The other problems were not a problem. Well, now they got problems with all 3. So if inflation is no longer the hardest thing to fight, you might see them cut rates. Certainly they have to pause first before they cut. December 13th is put up or shut up time. Cumulative effect of all the rate hikes We're at what, 525 to 550 with all the rate hikes that they've done? Remember, we've talked about what a Fed pivot looks like. Traditionally, a pivot means they're cutting, but it's kind of been redefined over the years, as are a lot of things in our market. A Fed pivot is 3 steps. Number one, smaller hikes. So now we're down to just quarters, although recently we're down to zeros. And then a complete stop, and then a cut. So every other Fed meeting, they put out what's called the dot plot, where the Fed says, this is our terminal rate. This is where we're going to stop. They didn't have to do that 2 weeks ago. They did it the last meeting in September, where they said they're going to do another quarter and get up above the 5.5 rate, get to about 5.6. Not all the Fed voting members, were unanimous. Why? Because not all of them know that inflation is the only fight to fight. You've got unemployment to fight, and it's starting to crack. I'm going to get into that in a second, and I'm going to talk about the SOM rule, which is very important. But on December 13th, the cumulative effect of all of these rate hikes are continued to constrict demand and hurt our economy. And we're seeing it show up. We know everything that's rate sensitive. Mortgages, car loans, credit card loans, everything. Small business loans, small businesses which make up the bulk of job creation in America. Everything is getting constricted from this cumulative effect. So, on December 13th, the Fed is going to have to say on a dot plot where they think the terminal rate is at. And that will have been the third meeting. Whether they add 25 basis points or not, which a lot of people are spiking down the football and saying they're done and the next move's a cut. Maybe. They've been pretty steadfast in saying and doing everything they said. Inflation is still at 4%. PCE, which doesn't come out until the 30th of this month, the personal consumption expenditure, is at 3.7%. Is that 2%? Are they really going to get to 2%? They say they're going to get to 2%. We're not at 2%. Yes, the rate is slowing, but it is still cumulative on top of the past data points. And so whether you slice it down to core, which if you strip out food and energy, you got a 3 handle, some kind of 3% number on that. There's super core where you take out housing, food and energy, you're at 3.7%. I even saw one in the CPI that only takes out housing. And that put us at 1.5%, obviously below the 2%. But we know that the data has a lag effect, right? Rent, owner's equivalent rent. These kinds of data points have been lagging in the CPI. And so we know that new asking rents for new rentals, new contracts for rentals, are less than existing rents for leases that were signed in the last 12 months. Think 12 months ago, way more expensive than today. Well, those 12 months ago numbers are still showing up in our inflation data. Lag effect. The guys at NBS Highway did a good job of breaking down the lag effect. I think they said something, I wrote it down here. Deanne was going over the numbers. Highway, it says shelter is 44% of CPI in this last report. 4%. 1% of that is lag effect. 2.3% is real. Saw some other data from Zillow. You talk about the difference between asking rents and actual rents. 18 months ago, Zillow said asking rents has peaked, and we know that's been coming down. Do you know that construction of rentals is the highest it's been in this country since the 70s? Rent competes with mortgages, and we're going into the winter. There is a cumulative effect of building and opening more doors. It means rent gets cheaper. It means shelter inflation comes down. So on December 13th, will those cumulative effects show up? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they do that other quarter anyway. I don't really know. But what I do think is as of December 13th, they're going to show on that dot plot, whether they raise a quarter or they do nothing else, they're going to say what the terminal rate is at, and I bet it'll be whatever it is at the end of that meeting. And that is certainty, and the market will crave for that. By the way, we're importing deflation from China. We're importing cheap pork price. They've got tons of supply and reserves in oil, and we're importing energy from them. Oil's at like $74 a barrel. So between now and February, we start to see oil go up here a little bit because of winter. Maybe we have a mild winter like we did last year, like Europe did last year. Remember all the fear about Ukraine war and Russia and the gas? It was unfounded. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt always goes away when there's certainty and there's data. Speaking of stripping things down to absolute super core, I thought it was cool to talk about the Thanksgiving, real quick. So the Farm Bureau Federation puts out an inflation gauge, the cost to make a Thanksgiving meal. 16 pounds of turkey, 30 ounces of pumpkin pie, gallon of milk, dinner rolls. There's a whole thing. This is an actual index. So although the cost of these things is like $61 versus $64 from last year because of wage inflation and the fact that wages are up, you actually have to work less hours this year. 1.75 hours, 1 hour and 45 minutes versus over 2 hours. That's progress. Have a great weekend. Cheers. Go Rangers.
You've been listening to KP Talks Dollars and Cents, a top-rated show for those who want to learn about the economy and mortgage environment. Tune in each week for more episodes, and please leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Kevin Perenio does not render or offer to render personalized investment or tax advice through KP Talks Dollars and Cents. The information provided is for informational purposes only and does not constitute financial, tax, investment, or legal advice. For more info, follow KP Talks Dollars and Cents on all of our social channels.